Katelyn, last night I went to the hottest event in New York City right now.
Ugh. What could it be? There are so many options. Was it Sunset Boulevard?
I went to my husband's Lenten prayer class.
What was the vibe at the Lenten prayer class?
Prayerful. I mean, it was like a group of like 15 people, and John was teaching on the examen. It was fun. Although he did at one point call me out and ask me if I knew the answer to something, and I didn't.
Oh, no. What was the question?
It was something like, what are the 4 tenets of Jesuit spirituality or something?
Was he trolling you in front of his congregants?
I was like, no one knows this question. Why are you asking me?
That stinker.
I know. I'm such a teacher's pet, too. It bothered me. I can't even
Sounds
remember
like
what they are, because the whole time I was like, how did I not know?
Sounds like a couples counseling session topic.
From Religion News Service, this is Saved by the City, a podcast from 2 Christian women who definitely have all the answers. I'm Roxy Stone.
And I'm Katelyn Beatty.
I will say this is one of the first like non-Sunday morning church things I've done with John's new church. Like I go to his sermon, like if he's preaching, I usually try to go. He doesn't preach every week, but I haven't done any of the like after church activities before.
Well, you have your own church
with
its own activities and schedule and community. So
yeah.
How did you and John navigate kind of being in 2 separate churches?
It's been a little tricky for sure. I mean, I've been part of my church for a long time, and I'm an elder. So I also have like elder board meetings, and also, it just means like I really can't just be like a Sunday morning show up person. Although I don't want to be either. Like I want to be involved in the life of the church that, I really care about. And when we were dating, that felt fine. Like he had his church thing and I had mine, but it's like harder to do that in some ways now, I think. And so there is sort of a bit of a, like, where's Roxy?
Well, you've gone from being a priest's girlfriend to a priest's wife. Right. And, this is the Episcopal Church. I don't think that there are super traditional gender roles that are dictating what you should or should not do. But do you feel like there maybe is an expectation that you be there more?
I don't know. I don't feel like I've picked up on that, really. I mean, I think people like get excited when they see me, or they're like, oh, this is the Roxy you talked about.
She's real.
Yeah. But John's the associate rector, and the rector, like his husband is there every Sunday. He does the flowers and the greenery and different things like that. He has some roles at the church, and I do not. They live right near the church. There's a rectory. Like there's things like that where I feel like I can just kind of see I can get away with this right now. But if and when John is the priest in charge or a rector, like there's maybe different expectations.
I have thought about you in relation to the new book, Becoming the Pastor's Wife, that we will be talking about a lot today, from Beth Allison Barr, a repeat guest. She's a Baylor historian as well as a Brazos Press author. So I know the book pretty well.
Yes, you do.
And in the course of editing the book, it was really interesting to learn how much material has been out there, especially in more Southern Baptist circles or more traditional or conservative evangelical circles, like actual guidebooks for pastors' wives on how to be a pastor's wife. That the expectations around it were so explicit and codified. And I don't know how true that is today as it was maybe 30 or 40 years ago, or how it translates to other theological and denominational contexts. But I have to think that there are still kind of, if not spoken, then unspoken expectations.
I will say it was pretty funny a few weeks ago when John saw that book on my desk as we were prepping, and I got like a text from him with a picture of it, and he was like, what is this and why are you reading it? Because I think he like literally thought that's what it was like a guidebook to like becoming the pastor's wife. And he was like, who are you? What is happening here? So I was like, read the subtitle.
Yeah, the book is basically the opposite. I don't think Brazos Press would publish a guidebook for pastor's wives. So the subtitle of the book is How Marriage Replaced Ordination as a Woman's Path to Ministry. Beth is arguing over time that women's independent spiritual leadership roles in the church were replaced by this pastor's wife model.
Mm-hmm. You know, Dorothy Patterson, who's our queen of the pastor's wife role, she says, you know, God never calls a wife to something different than her husband. Because God called the husband and you married him, you, by extension, now have that divine call. And it's not to be a separate ministry role. You are now divinely called to be part of his ministry role.
That's Beth Allison Barr, and we're going to talk with her later about her newest book, which just became a New York Times bestseller yesterday. Congratulations, Katelyn. It's a big deal. It's the editor of the book. That's great.
Thank you. I think it was kind of a shock to all of us, but it's really exciting. This is the first Brazos book, to my knowledge, that has hit the New York Times bestseller list.
Oh, really? Oh, that
we
is
didn't
exciting.
pay for it, as some people do.
Mm-hmm.
Let me go on the record.
Are you going to celebrate?
I happened to go karaokeing with a certain person who is actually relevant to the larger conversation we're going to be having today, but I don't want to give away too much.
Ooh. More on that later.
Yeah, exactly. I will say, editing this book, it was wild, some of the things that I came across. So Dorothy Patterson is kind of the matriarch of this SBC pastor's wife culture. Mm-hmm. And there's directions on like how to properly get in and out of a car in a skirt in a modest way.
Wow.
Obviously, there's a lot about keeping a perfect home because the expectation is like, well, anybody from the church could stop by at any given time. So you always have to be prepared to host. The house always has to be spick and span. You wouldn't want anybody in the church to see that you're not a domestic goddess. It's all the 50s housewife expectations, but with this spiritual gloss and expectation. If you are not doing all these things in support of your husband's pastoral role, you are not just failing as a woman, you're failing as a Christian wife and mother. So I'm glad that Beth is kind of taking some of that to task, obviously.
Definitely. All right. So we are of the elder millennial set.
Yeah.
I know. And as elder millennial women, we sort of grew up with this sense that maybe like the world was ours to take and we could be anything we wanted to be and we wouldn't be restricted by our gender and all the rest. And out of that, you know, in our 20s and 30s, we invented the girl boss meme. You might remember.
Yes. Hashtag girl boss became this archetype of a woman kind of kicking butt and taking names in the professional sphere and in every other sphere of life. Like she could do and be anything. I feel like the girl boss era is now considered cringe, right?
Oh, yeah. Gen Z killed the girl boss. Like probably for good reason, because I think the girl boss thing really was just like patriarchy dressed up a little bit. Like it was like, take down the patriarchy, but it was really just like bust the glass ceiling and do the job that the men are doing, plus be a mom, plus do yoga and have a great body, plus eat really healthy and all that.
I want to go on record to say I'm glad the girl boss is no longer a thing. Even though I did write a book maybe a decade ago that perhaps played into it and gave it a Christian gloss. Oops. But in the spirit of our generation, I thought we could imagine what a millennial girl boss's guide to being a pastor's wife might look like.
I imagine this book might be called something like All the Things Are Possible with God's Help. let's come up with some imaginary chapter titles and themes for this hypothetical millennial girl boss's guide to being the pastor's wife. I think there would definitely be a chapter titled, I'm not just a pastor's wife, I'm a she-o-o.
Oh, no. She-o-o. Is that a thing?
Yeah, I think the meme was like, I'm a she-e-o. But the pastor's wife guide would point out that the pastor's wife's role really is not just to be the wife, but really to run everything behind the scenes in the COO role. All the things, right, of the operations of the church. You're going to kick butt at that as a millennial girl boss.
Is the she-o-o paid for being the she-o-o?
Well, I do think that a millennial girl boss would make some kind of stink about not getting paid. I don't know whether she would win that battle or not, but
she would advocate for herself.
Let's hope.
One chapter title might be Small Church, Same Hustle, which is like, no matter the size of your husband's church, work hard, be supportive in the same way. Like, if you're running a small business, you're going to be hustling just as much as if you were running a big company, and maybe even more, because so much lands on you.
Speaking of hustle, I think that a title would definitely be Pastor's Wife is My Side Hustle, because a millennial girl boss would definitely have her own job. Also because nobody can live on a pastor's salary in today's day and age. Only like single family income on a pastor's salary, not so much. So, a millennial girl boss would have her own job, her own things to do, but she would never look too stressed out about it. Like, she'd be like, I can do all of this.
Rise and grind. But first, prayer. And also coffee.
I hate that meme so much. But first, coffee.
All of it. Rise and grind. Who says that? But first, prayer.
It's the worst.
Nope. I take my coffee first before prayer. The Lord knows why.
Last one. Handle your business without people knowing your business. I had not heard this girl boss meme, but I did find it on the internet, and it did feel very apropos for a pastor's wife, because there's church gossip. Like, that is reality. So you got to keep that under the covers. I was going to say.
Yep, definitely keep it under the covers. I am not a pastor's wife.
No.
Or a priest's wife, as you are. But I suppose the big reveal of this episode is that I have been getting to know a certain priest better.
Tell us more.
Yes, his name is Jack. He's a curate at a church outside of Pittsburgh. And last fall, both you and I were at the annual AAR-SBL, like academic religion conference.
It was more fun than it sounds.
Yeah. I mean, it was in San Diego, which is nice. I was there, in my capacity as the editorial director for Brazos, and Brazos and Baker Academic always have a big reception at the annual conferences. And so I was there mingling and drinking a glass of wine, and I recognized Jack's name on his name tag from Twitter, because he's really, I mean, I'm biased, but I think he's a good Twitter follow and really funny. And so I was like, oh my gosh, I have to go talk to Jack and introduce myself. And then we kept talking and saw each other the next night and like hung out. And then
this is my favorite part.
We realized that we were not only on the same flight out of San Diego the following morning, but that we were seated like one row behind each other.
Yeah.
We both ended up being in aisle seats. And so we were like, Jack would like turn around and we'd chat, and then we'd go back, and there was all this like fluttery. We had, exchanged phone numbers, and then we just, kept in touch after the conference. And Pittsburgh and Columbus are 3 hours apart. So we made things official shortly after the conference. So it's early, but it's also really exciting.
I mean, you're already karaokeing together, so.
That was a big milestone in my mind. Like, okay, how is he going to respond to this? Is he going to be into it? And he was. So yeah, it's really fun. Also, I know this is such a cliche, but I think a lot of our listeners know in my leaving New York and moving back to Ohio, this was not on my radar. I kind of very much backburnered the dating and relationship thing and was frustrated and just like, whatever, this is probably not going to happen.
Tale as old as time. As soon as you leave New York.
But several people have said, oh, it's like a Hallmark movie. Like the stressed single editor returns to her hometown and meets a nice guy. Anyway.
I do feel like, is this like maybe a hazard of our career choices? Because I do think we've both dated kind of more than a normal share of priests, pastors, ministry men.
Yeah, definitely a through line in a lot of my dating relationships has been being drawn to men who are like theologically smart or interested or have some kind of ministry or church orientation. You have that as well. There's a through line.
I mean, the last guy I seriously dated was also a pastor in a church. I can name others, like enough over the years that my therapist was like, maybe you should stop dating pastors and just become one. Like, I think she was getting at this idea that maybe I was dating the thing I wanted to become. So I felt a little called out by Beth's subtitle of her book, where it was like, how marriage replaced ordination. Because I was like, that's what my therapist said. I don't know if I really would ever want to be a pastor or not. Like, there are some clear things about that particular vocation that feel tricky for me. Like, you really, really have to like people and like being around people, and that can be a little hard for me.
That's exactly why I'm like, when I think about it, I'm like, no.
That's too much.
The only part, I asked my former priest in New York this. I was basically like, okay, the part of being a priest that really appeals to me is the idea of giving sermons.
Same.
Like writing and delivering sermons. That sounds awesome. I can do that for sure.
And like handing out communion and stuff. But
I was like, do you have to like people to do this? He was like, absolutely. That is the real work. And I mean, I joke like, I don't really like people. It's not that, just the capacity, the energy to show up for people.
Yeah. Now, being married to a priest, I see it. I'm like, wow, this is a very emotionally demanding job. And people do need and want a lot from him. And that's his role. I mean, they're supposed to call when they're in trouble, or they're supposed to be like, my mom's in the hospital.
Right.
He just interacts with a lot of people during the week in a way that I do not.
You can see how, because the needs of people around you are so great, that your role as a pastor bleeds beyond like the church or the office. Like, I'm thinking about a rectory being right next to a church.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And people, I'm sure, like stopping by the rectory at all hours of the day, and how if you're not the pastor, but you're the pastor's spouse, you would either really have to like that, or you could get really resentful because the boundaries are really porous.
I have begun to realize this a little bit just in like the schedule, you know, because it is not a 9 to 5 kind of schedule. I'm like, oh, that demands something of me, even if I'm not regularly attending John's church or meeting with all of his parishioners or being part of the altar guild or whatever. Like, my schedule and my time with him is different than it would be if he had like a 9 to 5 job, you know? How is it being a priest girlfriend so far?
So, because we don't live in the same place, you know, we take turns driving back and forth, visiting each other. If I'm there on a weekend, you know, I will go to his church for the later service and then hang out at coffee hour. And it's a small church. It's a lot of older congregants, and in the way that they are really excited that Jack is there, I think maybe they're excited that like another young person is there. There have been a couple comments where I think people might be confused that I am just his girlfriend at this stage.
Oh, yeah.
So at coffee hour one Sunday, a woman came up to me and I remembered her name from the last time that we had interacted. Like, good to see you, so-and-so. And she was like, oh, you remember names so well. That's a really great skill for a priest's wife to have.
Oh.
And I said, oh, I'm not, Jack and I aren't married. We're dating. And she said, well, that's really good training for the future.
Oh, yeah.
I was like, okay, so this is just a taste of the expectations that I think a lot of pastors, priests, wives might face. And I definitely felt like, oh, she is thinking of me as having a very specific role, like almost being like the first lady of the church.
I have found myself wanting to be more a part of John's church. I think especially if he became a priest in charge or a rector, like I would feel like, okay, it's time for us to be in the same church. I don't know. Like, I don't want to do all the things. Like, I don't want to be a children's ministry director. Like, I feel like my faith is a part of the work that I do out in the world. And that's been the case for a long time. Like, I don't think that I need to feel a different calling than what I have. But I can also see how being a priest's wife is different than being like an engineer's wife or like a general contractor's wife or fill in the blank wife. I do think there are some ways that it pulls you in part because we too want to be part of the church, And so I think it does ask something more of a spouse than a lot of other spousal roles. But I feel like I'm still kind of trying to figure out what that is and what I feel comfortable with it being.
Well, let's hear from our guest today, Beth Allison Barr, because in addition to being a historian and a best-selling book author, she is also a pastor's wife herself, and she knows a lot of these spoken and unspoken expectations and the unique role that a pastor's wife might have coming up. But first, let's give a shout out to the organization that makes this all possible.
Religion News Service is an independent, award-winning source of global reporting on religion, spirituality, culture, and ethics.
From priests to imams to rabbis, Religion News Service covers clergy life both in public and behind the scenes.
One of the easiest ways to engage Saved by the City these days is via social media. Find us on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube.
Which apparently is the most popular way today that people listen to podcasts, which doesn't make any sense to me, but we're there because we want to serve the people.
Come find us.
You can also send us an email at sbtcpodcast@religionnews.com.
Beth Allison Barr is a professor of history at Baylor University and the best-selling author of The Making of Biblical Womanhood, How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth, and her recent, newest, now a New York Times bestseller, Becoming the Pastor's Wife, How Marriage Replaced Ordination as a Woman's Path to Ministry. So, welcome to the show, Beth.
Thanks for having me.
You're one of our few returning guests, so it speaks to how highly we consider. And I'm not biased as your editor at all.
I was going to say. Well, thanks for having me back.
Yes.
Okay, well, to start, maybe tell us a little bit about the wide-ranging expectations of a pastor's wife.
Yeah. The pastor's wife really embodies, in many ways, the church and the ministry of the church. And so this goes from her home to her appearance, to her ministry, as well as her demeanor, how she responds to people. Is she kind to people? Does she have a tone in her voice? You know, pastors' wives get tone policed all the time for how they talk to other people. I guess her activities, her ministry encompasses not just what she does, but also how she looks, and even to how well she keeps her house clean. You know, I think about Dorothy Patterson's excerpt where she, in her handbook for pastors' wives, which was originally published in 2001, in which she says, a sink full of dirty dishes in the parsonage may not be everyone's business, but it is everyone's gossip. And and I'm just like,
Yes.
my gosh, the pressures on these women who can't even have dirty sinks.
You refer to this concept of ministry by marriage. What is this ministry that pastors' wives are expected to fulfill?
Essentially anything that their husband or their church needs them to fulfill. I analyzed 150 pastors' wife books across 1923 to 2023. And this language, while you see this language of calling kind of scattered throughout them, it picks up significantly by the time we get to these books in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s. And it's this idea that, Dorothy Patterson, again, who's our queen of the pastor's wife role, she says, God never calls a wife to something different than her husband.
Wow.
And so that because God called the husband and you married him, you by extension now have that divine call. And it's not to be a separate ministry role. You are now divinely called to be part of his ministry role. And she makes that crystal clear that this isn't you doing ministry. This is you being a helpmeet to your husband's ministry.
Some women might hear that kind of 2-in-1 model, like you're called to do all the things that your husband is called to do as pastor, except potentially preach, depending on your setting or denomination, and think, wow, I get to do so much to serve the church. Like I'm actually empowered or equipped to serve or minister directly in this really meaningful way. I imagine some listeners might ask, like, what's the problem with being the pastor's wife? It sounds like it's great.
I can speak really well to that because I'm somebody who actually likes the pastor's wife role. I like not having to always be doing ministry, but I can do what I want to do when I want to do it. And I like being a behind the scene person, like fixing things. I'm a good behind the scenes fixer. So that's something I like to do. But the problem is when you say that this is the calling for every woman, that every woman who marries a man who's in ministry is required to serve in this same way. And that's where it begins to be problematic. I think there's some women that really flourish in this role, because it fits their personality, it fits their gifting. This is all they really want to do. And that's great. But I've read enough of those pastor's wife books to know that there is a large number of women. In fact, I might even say the majority of women who this is not an easy role. And so much of those pastor's wife books are actually like trying to talk women down from the cliff. Like, you can do this. This is really hard, but you can do this because God wouldn't call you to do something that he didn't equip you to do. And so you see a lot of this really like trying to cheer each other on because this is such a difficult, challenging role that most women don't feel equipped for.
How has the role of pastor's wife evolved or looked different across different denominations? For example, I think about Hillsong or some other charismatic non-denoms where the wife is like often referred to as a co-pastor and she'll even preach, versus like Southern Baptist churches where it's more of this behind the scenes role, certainly not preaching. You also spend time in the book examining the role of the first lady in Black churches. So how are these roles kind of different, or how have they evolved in different ways across these denominations?
So on the one hand, there is a lot of difference, but there also, as the traditions moving into the latter half of the 20th century, we do see a lot of continuity emerging, that even though there may be, it's sort of like complementarian theology. There is a spectrum of complementarian theology. There are people on one end of it who don't let you do anything at all. And then there's the other end of it where women can do anything but senior pastor. And this is exactly what we find with the pastor's wife role. The only caveat that I would put in there is that even in places like Hillsong, this co-pastor role, the primary role is still that of the husband. And I think a really good example of this is when the husband loses his job, the wife is fired too. And so even though she's able to do a whole lot more, her job, her ministry is still dependent on the ministry of her husband. And I think that's the key factor in the evolution of the pastor's wife role, is that her ministry at some level is dependent on the ministry of her husband.
Yeah, that it's highly contingent and also in a lot of contexts unpaid.
Yes.
So talk about this unpaid work dimension of the pastor's wife role.
Yes. And this is something that certainly emerged as one of the primary arguments that I make, is that not only is this role a secondary role in the sense and dependent on the ministry of the husband, but it usually is unpaid or paid very low and considered to often be volunteer. I mean, it literally is 2 for the price of 1. You hire a pastor and then you get the labor of his wife that is expected. And like Dorothy Patterson, and, she says pastor's wife should not be paid for her work in the church because she said, then you become a paid employee and there's more expectations put on you, like to have regular hours. And the pastor's wife really needs to be able to be at the beck and call of what her husband needs.
Oh, if she's a paid employee, then there will be limits on the number of hours she can put in. If she's an unpaid employee, then she can just be omni-available and no one will bat an eye.
That is exactly right.
Thanks, Dorothy. Is Dorothy still with us?
She is still with us. I was actually just watching videos of her the other day teaching.
So one of the things that you do best, Beth, as a historian, is help modern Christians understand this broader, richer history of women in the church, in the pre-modern, medieval, late medieval church, even Reformation era church.
Reformation, yeah.
That the notion that a woman could be a pastor and teach and lead with official authority is not some new phenomenon brought on by the feminist movement, that we see examples throughout church history of women leading and teaching authoritatively, kind of officially in these roles. And one of the biggest claims of your new book is that there's a causal link between the slow erasure of those roles for women and the rise of the role of pastor's wife. So talk about how the two are connected.
So when I first began thinking about doing this book, I was reading one of my colleagues at Baylor's book. Her name is Elizabeth Flowers, and she has a book. It's called Into the Pulpit, Southern Baptist Women in Power in the Post-World War II Era. And she's describing the rise of the fundamentalist takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention, which starts happening in the 70s and moves through the 80s and 90s. And in it, she describes the women who are on the forefront of fighting for this more conservative theology that is especially against female pastors. And the women who are on the front lines, if I can use that term, are pastors' wives. And this really caught my attention because here we have women in ministry who are the most active, vocal critics of women in ministry. And so what I found is that it came at this really critical moment where we have this long history of women serving in a variety of roles in ministry, sometimes married to pastors, sometimes not, sometimes, single in their ministry, sometimes married, but their husbands aren't participants in that ministry, a whole variety of things. But what we begin to see is that model, those images of those women begins to fade significantly. And what we begin to see focus is the image of women as wives. And that the primary calling for women in ministry is through their marriage. And either that can be in the house. You hear all the time that a woman's primary calling, her primary ministry is to her family. And then if there's other things she can do outside that, but that's your primary calling. And as this image gets more traction in churches and we start seeing, it's the spread of biblical womanhood that is being led by pastors' wives, what we begin to see is really a demonization of women in independent ministry roles, and the emphasis that not only is this a different calling, but this is not a godly calling, that women who are doing separate ministry, that they are often doing it out of pride, out of sin, out of feminist rebellion, because God doesn't call women to preach. And that's what you hear. I cite some research studies why people in more conservative churches, when you ask them, how do you feel about your church not supporting women in ministry? And they're like, our church supports women in ministry. Look at the pastor's wife. Women in our church can do anything. Look how visible they are. And of course, what they don't see is that those women are not getting paid for that labor, and that those women would not be able to be in those positions if it wasn't for their marriage to a pastor. It creates this image of women being very active in ministry in these conservative churches, but without having to give women the titles or pay them for their job.
I have recently become a pastor's wife, really a priest's wife in the Episcopal Church. So a little different, definitely different than I remember the expectation being on the pastor's wife at my Southern Baptist church growing up. But I do feel like there is something there. And I'm kind of maybe wrestling with this. And so wondering if you could speak into this as also a pastor's wife, like maybe there is something to feeling like there's a calling in this or some kind of draw to support or help or be part of the life of the church where your husband is a pastor. So speak a little bit into that, maybe.
I think there is actually a lot of value in the pastor's wife role if that is what the pastor's wife wants to do. It is a very visible role. It is a role that can have a great deal of influence. I mean, I even think about the churches that we have been in. And even though I now know I served in some ways as a negative model in the sense that me serving in an unpaid labor role was setting that expectation for other women who were watching me. That's something I've only recently come to grips with in understanding how the pastor's wife role works. Yet at the same time, I know because I am a pastor's wife who also has my own career and managed, having children, being married, as well as doing ministry, I also set a very different type of model for a lot of the young women and men in our youth group and even at our church. And so it is a role that can be really helpful and useful if a woman feels called that way. I think that's really the kicker. If this is a calling that you want, it can be a really powerful role as long as you're good at putting boundaries on it and knowing like you don't have to do everything the church expects of you. If my book does nothing else, I hope maybe it calls out in these conservative spaces how many challenges and difficulties and unfair things they have done to the women married to their pastors.
Final question. It's valuable to learn history, including church history, because it raises the question of how things could have turned out differently.
Yes.
If there hadn't been certain movements and bad actors kind of squelching this visible role of women serving in their own independent ministry in the church. So, what have we lost as we have lost that model?
Yeah. I mean, this to me is just so sad. I've talked to many women who lived through the conservative takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention. And what I found is that while a few of the women stayed, a whole lot of these women called to ministry left. They simply left the denomination. Some of them walked away from faith altogether because they were like, if this is faith, if God is putting these types of limits on me, then who is this God? Some of them walked away and some of them just simply went on to another denomination. I think about Meredith Stone, who's the director of Baptist Women in Ministry. And she says that part of her ministry is letting women know that there are places that welcome their gifting and their callings and allow them to serve. And so you think about what these denominations have lost is the giftings of these women. I think about the Southern Baptist Convention, and the Southern Baptist Convention only survived because of the ministry and the gifting of women who financially kept it alive, like during the Great Depression and et cetera. And they lost these women. They left. And the church, I'm thinking also about that recent New York Times article, which caused a big ruckus in my hometown of Waco because it featured a church in Waco. But women are walking away from the church. And evidence suggests that one of the reasons they're walking away is because they are being expected to conform to ideals that don't match them and that really aren't biblical or even historical.
Mm-hmm.
They feel like there's no place for what they feel called to do or what they want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're just walking out. There was a pastor in my hometown who was like, well, that's not our church. You know, it's a really big church in town. He's like, we have tons of women here. And I was just looking and I was like, this is like rejecting climate change.
Yeah.
I was like, look at the evidence and let's talk again in 10 years. You need to watch the evidence because women are walking away.
Thank you so much for your time and insights, Beth.
Yeah,
and again,
thank
I'm
you.
very biased, but I think everyone should go read Becoming the Pastor's Wife. We only skimmed the surface. So yeah, thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's been fun.
It has. Thank you.
So we've been talking a lot about what it's like to be a pastor's wife, but it's probably good since we have the opportunity to get the flip side of the perspective, hearing from a pastor himself on these marital dynamics.
Wherever would we find one?
Remember how we had a hot priest segment? Hot priest! In our first couple seasons, I feel like now is the time to bring that back.
With an even hotter priest. No offense, but
Totally unbiased perspective
Absolutely.
from you. Do you want to introduce him?
Bring him on. A hot priest in residence, John Schmidt. Also my husband.
Yeah, important detail. Hi, John.
Hey, John.
Hi, guys.
Welcome back.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
welcome back. This is your second appearance on Saved by the City.
I know. Third time is a habit. So just, be careful what you asked for.
That was threatening.
Ominous.
Okay, so really quickly, you're a pastor, more specifically a priest, at a church in New York.
Mm-hmm.
And you've served as a priest in various settings in New York and beyond. What is it like to be the husband of a pastor's wife?
Yeah. So I think being relatively newly married, I've been a priest single longer than I have been married. Knowing that Roxy has her own faith community that she's a part of, I never really expected her to come and, drop everything to come and be by my side in ministry. Mm-hmm. And so I always kind of knew that, she would have her faith community and I would have mine. And so that was something I kind of expected and, never asked her, you have to be here at certain times or you need to show up for, this coffee hour or this particular pastoral meeting or this event that we're having. But something funny kind of happened over time. I realized I was missing her and I wanted her to kind of be by my side in a weird way, not like as like arm candy or not in some way of like, I want to show you off, which, I do. But I realized I kind of missed sharing that part of my life with her because it's an important part of my life to me. And so she started to show up to, my sermons. That was the way in was her kind of wanting to be there to hear what I had to say, probably making sure that it wasn't heresy. She was just like fact checking and editorializing things, but it was great. I mean, I felt so supported by seeing her. And when I would preach and I'd look out and see her face, mostly smiling back at me. Sometimes I think she took a snooze one time during one of my sermons. That's okay.
It's not true.
Mm-hmm.
This is apocryphal.
It's clear, John, you do not hold to this idealistic image of the pastor's wife. So you are not bringing that expectation, but have other people at different churches kind of given you advice or made comments that are like, well, when you're married, blah, 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 or where's Roxy? She should blah, blah, blah.
I've definitely gotten the, where's Roxy? Where's your wife? Is she real? Are you making her up? I've never gotten she should be. Roxy's never been shoulded by any of the churches I've been a part of, which I really appreciate. I think there's more of a confusion. Like if you're married, you should be around your spouse. And so you're married and you presumably love your spouse. So where is she? We would like to meet her. I love this. I appreciate it so much because people are curious about you. Your congregation, your people want to know you as I want to know them. And it's this beautiful moment of knowing each other. Now, since I've been married and since I've known Roxy, part of me is her. And so I think people, as they want to know me, I think it feels very natural that they'd want to know her. And what I'm realizing is there's a part of me that would also like her to be known too. I've never had someone say, why isn't your wife running the children's ministry? Or why isn't she going to go, on a mission trip with us? Or why isn't she going to, clean up after coffee hour or, run an event or whatever? I think people are just like, we want to know her. We want to see her. And so people have often asked, like, where's she at?
Well, she's probably off editing some kind of religion scholar or recording a podcast, kicking ass and taking names.
No doubt. Or critiquing my sermon from afar.
Okay.
No, I'm giving her a hard time. She's very supportive.
I'm going to pray for y'all.
Saved by the City is a religion news service production. The producer is Jay Woodward, and the consulting editor is Paul O'Donnell. We get production assistance from Julia Wyndham.
Chaz Rousseau put together our look, and Martin Fowler wrote our theme music.
We are Roxy Stone.
And Caitlin Beatty. Thanks for listening.
Does that question work?
Yes.
Don't start editing our script.
You just have to go.
Okay, sorry.